Every animal on a farm in Australia is now part of a system most people outside agriculture have never heard of. Not a slogan, not a rumor, an actual functioning database that knows where a cow was born, every property it has stood on, and in many cases, where it is standing right now. For decades, this only applied to cattle. Then it was extended to sheep, then to goats. And every year, the technology attached to these animals gets a little more precise, a little more constant, a little harder to opt out of. To the government and to the meat industry, this is simply modern biosecurity. To a growing number of farmers, it feels like something else entirely, a slow and steady tightening of control over an industry that used to run on a handshake, a brand, and a farmer's word. This is the story of how Australia built the most comprehensive livestock tracking system in the world, why it exists, who benefits from it, what it costs the people who actually own the animals, and why some farmers are starting to ask whether they still own their livestock in the way they think they do. Start with the basics, because most people, even people who eat meat every single day, have no idea this system exists. It is called the National Livestock Identification System, NLIS for short, and it was built around the turn of the century after a string of disease scares rattled export markets that Australia depended on. Mad cow disease had devastated the beef industry in the United Kingdom. Foot and mouth disease had torn through Europe. Buyers around the world started asking a very simple but very expensive question. If something goes wrong with your meat, can you tell us exactly where the animal came from, what it ate, what it was near, and who touched it? Countries that could not answer that question lost contracts overnight. Countries that could answer it kept selling. Australia, which exports the overwhelming majority of the beef, lamb, and goat meat it produces, could not afford to be a country that could not answer that question. So the government and the industry built one of the most rigorous traceability systems on the planet, and cattle were first. Every single beef and dairy animal in the country must now carry an approved electronic identification device before it can legally leave the property where it was born. Not a printed number, not a branding iron mark, an actual radio frequency chip sealed inside a tag clipped through the ear, or in some cases, a bolus sitting permanently inside the animal's stomach. That chip carries a unique number linked to the property identification code of the farm where the animal was born. From that moment on, the animal is in the system. Every time it moves, whether to another paddock under different ownership, to a sale yard, to a feedlot, or finally to an abattoir, that movement is supposed to be logged into a national database within 48 hours. The whole point is that if a disease outbreak happens tomorrow, authorities do not need to guess which farms are at risk. They can pull up the exact life history of every animal that came into contact with the infected one, trace it back through every property it has touched, and shut down only the affected properties, instead of shutting down an entire region or an entire export market. On paper, that sounds sensible, even admirable. Nobody wants a repeat of the disasters that hit Britain and Europe. Farmers themselves generally agree that some form of traceability protects the industry as a whole because a single serious disease outbreak with no way to trace its origin could collapse export markets that took generations to build. But the story does not stop with cattle, and it does not stop with disease control. And this is where things start to get more complicated and more expensive and more invasive for the people actually running these farms. In 2022, the National Biosecurity Committee, made up of state and territory agriculture ministers, agreed on something farmers had resisted for years, extending the same mandatory electronic tagging regime from cattle to sheep and goats. Cattle are relatively few in number and relatively high in individual value, so tagging every single one was always going to be manageable. Sheep are a completely different proposition. A single property can run tens of thousands of sheep. Multiply the cost of an electronic tag, the cost of the applicator, the cost of a reader, the cost of the labor to physically catch and tag every lamb across a flock that size, and the numbers stop looking like a minor administrative inconvenience and start looking like a serious structural cost imposed on an entire industry almost overnight. The rollout was staged, presumably to soften the blow. From the 1st of January 2025, every sheep and goat born from that date forward has to carry an electronic tag before it can leave the property of its birth. That deadline has already passed. The next deadline, the one still ahead as this system finishes tightening its grip, is the 1st of January 2027, when the requirement expands to cover every sheep and goat moving off a property regardless of when it was born. In other words, within a very short window, there will be no sheep or goat left in Australia that has not been individually chipped, scanned, and logged into a government-linked database. Victoria moved even faster than the rest of the country, having required mandatory electronic tagging of sheep and goats since 2017, years ahead of everyone else, effectively acting as the testing ground for what the rest of the nation is now being pushed toward. Governments and industry bodies knew this transition would hurt financially, so they rolled out rebate schemes, state by state, to soften the pain. Some states offered a discount of around 75 cents per tag at the point of sale. Others ran rebate programs worth millions of dollars specifically to offset the cost of readers, scales, and applicators. New South Wales ran a sheep and goat EID tag discount program. South Australia opened rebate windows for devices purchased outside the standard year of birth color scheme. Victoria, having started earliest, offered over $11 million in rebates in a single funding round just to help producers absorb the shock of transition. If you strip away the technical language, what you are looking at is a government quietly acknowledging that this system is expensive enough to farmers that it needs direct financial intervention to avoid political backlash, while simultaneously insisting to the public that the whole thing is simply modern, sensible, unavoidable progress. And the truth is, it probably is unavoidable, at least in the sense that international buyers increasingly demand this kind of traceability as the price of doing business. If Australia wants to keep selling meat into markets like the European Union, Japan, South Korea, the United States, and increasingly China, it needs paperwork and digital records that prove, animal by animal, exactly where that meat came from and what conditions it was raised in. Countries that cannot provide that proof get quietly dropped from supply chains in favor of competitors who can. So there is a very real commercial argument that this system exists to protect the very livelihood of the farmers being asked to pay for it. But knowing why a system exists does not make it any less uncomfortable to live inside of, especially when the burden of paying for compliance falls almost entirely on the individual producer, while the benefits, easier access to lucrative export contracts, flow disproportionately to processors, exporters, and large-scale operators who can absorb the administrative load far more easily than a family running 600 sheep on a property 3 hours from the nearest town. This is where the story shifts from a straightforward biosecurity narrative into something farmers themselves describe in far more uneasy terms. Because tagging an animal is only step one. The tag itself is largely passive. It only tells anyone anything when the animal physically passes a scanner at a yard, at a crush, at a sale yard gate, at the door of an abattoir. For years, that passive system was the entire picture. You knew where an animal had been, not where it currently was. But agricultural technology has moved much faster than most people realize, and a second parallel layer of tracking has quietly grown up alongside the mandatory government system, one that is not required by law, at least not yet, but that an increasing number of large operations are adopting anyway. This second layer is GPS and satellite-based livestock tracking, sold by private companies, marketed directly to station owners and large-scale producers, promising something the government system never could: real-time location. A modern GPS ear tag, sometimes solar-assisted, sometimes running on long-life batteries, can ping a satellite or a local network gateway and report an animal's exact coordinates at intervals as frequent as every few minutes. On a station covering hundreds of thousands of hectares, where mustering cattle by helicopter or motorbike can burn through fuel and labor costs that eat directly into already thin profit margins, this technology is genuinely useful. It lets an owner sitting at a laptop see, in near real time, where every tagged animal in a paddock actually is, whether a mob has drifted toward a dangerous section of fence line, whether an animal has stopped moving entirely, which can be an early warning sign of injury, illness, or death. Industry advice for producers. Adopting this technology is telling in itself. Farmers are advised not to tag every single animal, both because of the cost and because it is largely unnecessary, since tagging just the leaders of a mob, the dominant bulls, the older experienced cows that the rest of the herd tends to follow, gives you a reliable picture of where the entire group is without paying to track every single beast. That is a practical piece of advice, but it also reveals something important. This is a system explicitly designed to work even when most animals are not directly monitored, because the goal is total situational awareness of the herd, not affection for any individual animal. The animal becomes a data point, a proxy for the movement of the group, a sensor rather than a creature. Companies selling this technology are very clear that it is meant to sit alongside the mandatory NLIS tag, not replace it, since NLIS remains the only legally recognized method of identification for the purposes of movement and sale. But the direction of travel is obvious to anyone paying attention. What started as a legal requirement to prevent disease outbreaks from crippling an export industry has, within a couple of decades, evolved into an entire commercial ecosystem of private companies selling constant, granular, real-time surveillance of livestock, built on top of a government-mandated identification layer that already tracks every single animal's movement between properties. Once that infrastructure exists, once every animal already carries a chip and every property is already registered and every movement is already logged in a national database, adding a second, denser layer of monitoring is not a leap. It is simply the next logical upgrade, sold not by government decree but by the market itself, promising efficiency, welfare benefits, and better returns to any farmer willing to buy in. And it is worth pausing here to ask what this data actually becomes once it exists, because that is the part almost nobody explains clearly to the people generating it. The movement records inside the national database are not simply sitting in a locked vault somewhere, used only in the rare event of a disease outbreak. They form a permanent, growing, animal-by-animal history of every property, every sale, every transfer of ownership across the entire livestock sector. Regulators use it for biosecurity, yes, but it is also the exact kind of data set that underpins claims made to consumers about where meat comes from, whether it was genuinely grass-fed, whether animals were genuinely free-roaming, whether supply chains meet the ethical and environmental standards that increasingly wealthy overseas buyers are willing to pay a premium for. Verified movement histories and grazing patterns can be turned directly into marketing material, the kind of provenance story that supermarket chains and premium export buyers use to justify charging more for a product. In other words, the very data farmers are legally required to generate at their own expense, in their own time, using tags they had to buy themselves, becomes raw material that adds value further up the supply chain, in the hands of processors, exporters, and retailers who never had to buy a single tag or catch a single lamb. None of this makes the system corrupt or illegitimate on its own. Supply chains have always worked this way. Value gets added at every step, and someone has to pay for the infrastructure that makes reliable data possible in the first place. But it does explain why so many working farmers describe this expansion with real frustration rather than gratitude. The rules keep multiplying, the compliance windows keep tightening, the tags keep getting more expensive. The penalties for non-compliance are real, and it is against the law to move livestock off a property without an approved identification device attached, with fines and enforcement action awaiting anyone who tries to skip the system, whether out of cost, convenience, or simple oversight. Meanwhile, the direct financial upside of all this new data mostly accrues to parties standing well outside the farm gate. There is also a quieter concern running underneath all of this, one that rarely makes it into official government communications, but that surfaces constantly in farming communities. And it has to do with control rather than cost. Every property in Australia that runs livestock now has to be registered under a property identification code, without which you cannot legally move an animal on or off your own land. Every tag purchased is automatically registered to that code by the manufacturer, whether the farmer explicitly requests it or not. Every sale, every private transfer, every movement through a sale yard has to be logged into a centralized national database within a strict legal time frame, with the responsibility for logging falling on the receiving party by law. Step back and look at the shape of the whole thing, and what you have built is a system in which no farmer in the country can move an animal they own without that movement being recorded, time-stamped, and stored in a government-linked database indefinitely, for every animal, every year, forever. Supporters of the system would say this is simply what modern regulated agriculture looks like everywhere in the developed world. That traceability protects farmers as much as anyone else by keeping export markets open, that it protects consumers from unsafe meat, and that the alternative, a return to the old system of paper records and brand marks, would leave the entire industry vulnerable to exactly the kind of catastrophic disease event that crippled British and European agriculture a generation ago. And there is real weight to that argument. Nobody serious is proposing Australia abandon animal traceability altogether. Even the most skeptical farmers tend to accept that some baseline level of tracking is necessary in a globally connected export economy where one infected animal, left untraced, could trigger the closure of markets worth billions of dollars. But accepting the necessity of a system is not the same as accepting every expansion of it without question. And that is precisely the tension sitting underneath this entire topic. The system started as a targeted, disease-specific safeguard for cattle. It has since expanded to cover every sheep and goat in the country. It is layered with an entirely separate commercial tracking industry, offering real-time satellite location on top of the mandatory government layer. It generates a permanent record of ownership and movement covering every single animal a farmer touches, a record that outlives any individual sale and that increasingly becomes commercially valuable to parties other than the farmer who created it. And every stage of this expansion has been introduced gradually enough and justified persuasively enough that most Australians, including most people who eat the meat this system tracks, have no idea any of it exists. That is really the heart of what makes this story worth telling. Not that any single piece of it is secret, because none of it actually is. The National Livestock Identification System has a public website, published legislation, industry guidance documents, and open consultation records stretching back over 20 years. Nothing about this has been hidden from public view in the way a genuine conspiracy would require. But there is a difference between information being technically public and information being widely understood. And almost nobody outside the farming community has ever had reason to look closely at how thoroughly this system now governs the ownership and movement of livestock in this country. It has expanded steadily, deadline by deadline, rebate program by rebate program, technology upgrade by technology upgrade, largely outside the awareness of the general public, precisely because each individual step seemed reasonable, modest, and justified on its own terms. Whether you view that as a quiet takeover or as the unglamorous incremental reality of how modern biosecurity regulation actually gets built depends largely on where you're standing. Stand in a government office concerned with protecting a multi-billion-dollar export industry from a single catastrophic disease outbreak. And this system looks like exactly the kind of careful, methodical infrastructure that responsible governance requires. Stand on a family sheep property, watching the bill for tags and readers grow every year while the rules tighten around what you can legally do with animals you have raised since birth. And the same system can start to feel like something closing in around you, one rebate program and one compliance deadline at a time. What is certain is that the direction of travel is not slowing down. The 2027 deadline for universal sheep and goat tagging is already locked in. Private GPS and satellite tracking companies are actively expanding their customer base among cattle stations, looking to cut mustering costs. Data integration between farm management software and national traceability databases is being marketed as the next essential upgrade for any serious producer. In export markets, the ultimate customers this entire system exists to satisfy show no sign of relaxing their demands for ever more granular, ever more verifiable proof of where their meat comes from. If anything, as consumer interest in ethical and environmental sourcing grows in wealthy overseas markets, the pressure for even more detailed tracking, covering not just movement but grazing patterns, feed sources, and welfare conditions, is only likely to increase. It helps to understand how this compares to what happens in the rest of the world because Australia is often described as though it invented livestock surveillance, when in reality it was simply one of the first countries to formalize it at national scale, and other major agricultural exporters have been racing to catch up ever since. The European Union runs its own extensive animal identification and movement regulations, with individual passports for cattle and mandatory electronic tagging for sheep and goats that in many ways mirror what Australia has built, partly because European regulators learned the same hard lessons from the same disease outbreaks that pushed Australia toward traceability in the first place. The United States, by contrast, has moved far more slowly and far more reluctantly, with a patchwork of voluntary and partial programs that ranchers there have fought against for years, concerns about cost, privacy, and government overreach that are now surfacing in Australian farming communities. New Zealand runs a system in some ways even more aggressive than Australia's, tracking not just cattle, sheep, and deer, but requiring near real-time reporting of movements in a country whose entire economy leans even more heavily on agricultural exports than Australia's does. So when you look at the global picture, Australia is not some uniquely surveilled outlier. It is closer to the leading edge of a trend that every serious livestock exporting nation is being pulled toward, whether by choice or by the demands of the international buyers who ultimately decide which countries get to sell into their markets. That context matters, because it changes the question from whether this kind of system should exist at all to whether the specific way Australia has built and expanded its version strikes the right balance between the legitimate need for traceability and the legitimate right of farmers to run their properties without an ever-thickening layer of compliance and cost sitting on top of every single animal. And that is where the real debate inside the farming community actually lives. Not in outright rejection of biosecurity, almost nobody serious argues for that, but in a much more specific and much more practical set of grievances. Farmers ask why the cost of compliance falls so heavily on the smallest operators who have to buy and apply exactly the same tags as a corporate feedlot running tens of thousands of head without anywhere near the same economies of scale to absorb that cost. They ask why rebate programs, however generous they sound in a press release, are often capped, time-limited, and require paperwork that eats into the very labor hours farmers are already stretched thin on. They ask what happens to a small hobby farmer running a handful of sheep for family use who suddenly finds themselves subject to the same electronic tagging regime as a station covering hundreds of thousands of hectares, because the law, as written, generally does not carve out meaningful exceptions based on scale. There's also a generational dimension to this story that rarely gets discussed openly, but that shapes how differently people react to it. Older farmers, who remember time when a cattle brand burned into a hide and a handshake at the saleyard were considered sufficient proof of ownership, tend to describe the shift toward electronic tagging and centralized databases as a fundamental change in what it means to own livestock at all. In the old system, an animal belonged to whoever's brand it carried, full stop, and the record of that ownership lived in the memory of the community and the physical mark on the animal itself. In the new system, ownership is mediated through a government database, verified by a scan of a chip, and subject to a legal requirement that every transfer be logged within a strict window or risk penalty. Younger farmers, especially those running larger, technology-forward operations, tend to see it differently, treating the databases and the tagging requirements as simply the operating environment they grew up with. No more remarkable than needing an internet connection or a bank account to run a modern business. Neither generation is wrong exactly, they are just describing two different eras of the same industry, separated by roughly 20 years of accumulating regulation. What almost everyone in the industry agrees on, regardless of age or scale, is that the pace of change has been relentless and shows no sign of slowing. Every few years brings a new deadline, a new mandatory category of animal, a new accreditation standard for tags, a new discount program that requires learning a new application process. Compliance has effectively become its own permanent, unpaid, part-time job layered on top of the actual physical work of raising animals, and that burden compounds every time the scope of the system expands, as it has from cattle alone to cattle and sheep to cattle, sheep, and goats, with talk already circulating in industry publications about whether other livestock categories could eventually be drawn into similar frameworks. As international buyers continue demanding tighter and tighter proof of origin for the food they import. And underneath all of that sits the quieter, harder to quantify question of what happens to all this accumulated data over time. Because a national database that has been logging the movement of every cow, sheep, and goat in the country for over 2 decades is not a static thing. It is a constantly growing asset. And assets like that tend to attract new uses that were never part of the original justification. What began purely as a disease control mechanism has already been repurposed as a marketing tool for provenance claims sold to premium buyers. It is not difficult to imagine a future where that same dataset becomes valuable for insurance risk modeling, for environmental and emissions reporting tied to trade agreements, for automated tax and levy calculations, or for entirely new regulatory purposes that have not even been proposed yet, simply because the infrastructure to do so already exists, and expanding its use is always cheaper than building something new from scratch. None of that is happening today in any confirmed, documented way, but the pattern of the last 20 years, quiet expansion, incremental justification, each step small enough to avoid real public scrutiny, suggests it would be naive to assume the system's current scope is its final scope. So the next time you sit down to a steak or a plate of lamb from an Australian farm, understand that the animal on your plate almost certainly carried a small electronic chip through most of its life, registered to a government database, linked to a property identification code, logged at every movement from the moment it left the property where it was born. Understand that the person who raised that animal paid for that chip themselves, paid for the reader that scans it, spent hours of unpaid labor catching and tagging animals to comply with a legal requirement they had very little say in shaping, and now operates under a level of regulatory visibility that would have been unimaginable to their grandparents a few generations ago. None of this is secret. All of it is documented, legislated, and publicly available if you know where to look. But very few people ever do look, and that gap between how thoroughly the system now governs Australian farming and how few people outside farming actually understand it is exactly what makes it worth paying attention to.